The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, published in 1848, is one of the first novels to deal with the theme of a woman leaving her husband to escape abuse, making it a radical and controversial work in its time. Written by Anne Brontë, the youngest of the Brontë sisters, the novel explores issues of gender, marriage, alcoholism, and morality in Victorian society. Through the character of Helen Huntingdon, Brontë presents a courageous woman who defies the expectations of her era, fighting for her own integrity and the well-being of her son. The novel stands out for its unflinching realism and its bold critique of societal norms, especially concerning the position of women in marriage. Plot summary. The arrival of the mysterious tenant. The story begins with the arrival of a mysterious young widow, Helen Graham, who moves into the isolated and decaying Wildfell Hall with her young son, Arthur. The novel is narrated primarily by Gilbert Markham, a local farmer who becomes intrigued by Helen and soon falls in love with her. The initial chapters introduce the small rural community where Helen settles and the gossip that arises from her unusual behavior. Helen is fiercely independent, reserved, and protective of her son, which raises suspicions among the townspeople. Her refusal to engage in local social life and her aloofness lead to wild speculation about her past, with some believing she is hiding a dark secret. Gilbert, however, is fascinated by Helen's strong will and moral character. He gradually earns her friendship, and they spend time together, discussing art, literature, and morality. Through these interactions, Gilbert's feelings for her deepen, but Helen remains distant and warns him that she cannot return his affections. As gossip about her past intensifies, Gilbert confronts Helen about the rumors, prompting her to reveal her shocking and tragic history. Helen's Diary. The middle section of the novel is presented in the form of Helen's diary, which she gives to Gilbert to explain the truth of her situation. Her diary takes the reader back several years to her life before she became the tenant of Wildfell Hall. As a young and naive woman, Helen married Arthur Huntingdon, a handsome but reckless and dissipated man. At first, Helen is captivated by Arthur's charm and passion, believing that she can reform him through her love. However, after their marriage, Arthur's true nature is revealed. He is selfish, indulgent, and prone to excessive drinking and debauchery. Despite Helen's efforts to guide him toward a more moral life, Arthur descends further into vice, surrounding himself with a group of equally corrupt friends, including the womanizing Ralph Hattersley and the hypocritical Lord Loughborough. Helen's diary paints a vivid picture of her emotional and psychological suffering as she watches her husband's behavior become more destructive. Arthur not only neglects her, but also flaunts his infidelities, openly engaging in affairs and bringing disreputable guests into their home. Helen endures his cruelty for several years, hoping for his reformation, but eventually realizes that her efforts are in vain. Her love for Arthur turns to pity, and finally, to revulsion as he sinks deeper into moral degradation. The most critical turning point comes when Arthur begins to have a detrimental influence on their young son. He encourages little Arthur to drink alcohol and adopt his own corrupt habits, which becomes the last straw for Helen. Determined to protect her son from his father's toxic influence, Helen resolves to leave Arthur and take her son away, even though this decision goes against all the social conventions of the time. Helen's escape and life at Wildfell Hall. Helen's decision to leave her husband is both daring and dangerous. In Victorian society, a woman had no legal rights to her own property, her children, or her independence once she was married. Women were considered the property of their husbands, and for Helen to flee her marriage was not only socially scandalous but also illegal. Nevertheless, Helen's fierce love for her son and her moral conviction give her the strength to defy societal norms. She carefully plans her escape, secretly preparing a place for herself and her son at Wildfell Hall, an old, abandoned family property. She leaves Arthur, taking only her art supplies, which she uses to support herself by selling paintings, her son, and a few personal belongings. After arriving at Wildfell Hall, Helen adopts the name Mrs. Graham and lives in isolation, determined to build a new life free from her husband's influence. The novel shifts back to the present, where Helen's diary ends, and Gilbert Markham, now fully aware of her tragic past, pledges his support and love for her. However, Helen remains firm in her decision not to remarry or become involved with Gilbert as long as Arthur is alive, believing it would be immoral and legally dangerous to form a new relationship while still married. Arthur Huntingdon's decline. Meanwhile, Arthur Huntingdon's life continues to spiral out of control. His excessive drinking and debauchery take a toll on his health, and he eventually becomes gravely ill. In a cruel twist of fate, Arthur is left bedridden and entirely dependent on others for care. Despite the abuse and suffering he inflicted on her, Helen returns to care for him in his final days, driven by her Christian sense of duty and compassion. She nurses him as he faces the consequences of his vices, but even on his deathbed, Arthur shows little remorse for his actions. His death, while tragic, represents the ultimate consequence of his hedonistic lifestyle. Arthur's decline and death are not portrayed with the romanticism or redemption often seen in Victorian literature. Instead, Brontë presents a stark, realistic depiction of the consequences of addiction and immorality. Arthur's death allows Helen to finally be free from the bonds of her marriage, but the novel's depiction of his end emphasizes the theme of moral responsibility and the destructive nature of unchecked self-indulgence. Resolution and Helen's new life. After Arthur's death, Helen is free to rebuild her life. Gilbert Markham, who has patiently waited and respected her boundaries throughout her ordeal, expresses his continued love for her. Now that she is no longer bound by her marriage, Helen is free to consider a future with Gilbert. The novel ends with their eventual marriage, suggesting a hopeful resolution for Helen's long journey of suffering, perseverance, and personal growth. However, Brontë's conclusion is far from the simple happy ending of many Victorian novels. Helen's experiences leave a lasting impact on her character, and her marriage to Gilbert is portrayed as a partnership based on mutual respect and understanding, rather than romantic idealism. Through Helen's story, Brontë emphasizes the importance of personal integrity, moral fortitude, and the right to self-determination, even in the face of immense social and legal constraints. Character analysis. Helen Graham / Huntingdon. Helen is one of the most compelling heroines in Victorian literature. Her strength, independence, and moral conviction set her apart from the passive, idealized female characters often found in novels of the period. Helen's decision to leave her husband and protect her son is an act of immense bravery, especially given the legal and social ramifications of such a choice. She is a deeply religious woman, but her faith is not one of submission. Rather, it is a source of inner strength and moral clarity that guides her actions. Throughout the novel, Helen is portrayed as a woman of great intellect and artistic talent. Her ability to support herself through painting highlights her resourcefulness and independence. Despite the hardships she endures, Helen remains committed to her principles, never compromising her sense of right and wrong. Her ultimate triumph is not just in escaping an abusive marriage, but in maintaining her dignity and integrity in the face of overwhelming adversity. Arthur Huntingdon. Arthur Huntingdon is the novel's primary antagonist, representing the corrupt and hedonistic aspects of upper-class society. He is charming, handsome, and charismatic, but beneath the surface, he is selfish, immoral, and destructive. His alcoholism and debauchery are central to his character, and he embodies the dangers of unchecked self-indulgence. Arthur's decline and eventual death serve as a stark warning about the consequences of living a life without responsibility or moral consideration. Despite his many flaws, Arthur is not a wholly irredeemable character. Brontë presents him as a product of a society that encourages vice and indulgence in wealthy men while offering little accountability. His tragic end highlights the destructive nature of addiction and the moral rot that can result from a life of excess. Gilbert Markham. Gilbert, the novel's narrator, represents a more conventional hero, though he undergoes significant personal growth over the course of the story. Initially, Gilbert is somewhat impulsive and quick to judge, but his relationship with Helen forces him to confront his own prejudices and assumptions. Through his interactions with Helen, Gilbert learns the value of patience, understanding, and respect for others' experiences. Gilbert's love for Helen is genuine, but it is tempered by his willingness to give her the space and autonomy she needs. His evolution as a character reflects the novel's broader themes of moral growth and the importance of respecting women's independence. Other characters. The novel features a host of secondary characters, many of whom serve as foils or contrasts to the main figures. Ralph Hattersley, for example, is initially a corrupt friend of Arthur's but undergoes a moral transformation after marrying Millicent, a woman of strong moral character. Lord Loughborough, another member of Arthur's social circle, represents the consequences of vice, as his own marriage is destroyed by his wife's infidelity. Themes: gender and power. One of the central themes of the Tenant of Wildfell Hall is the power imbalance between men and women, particularly within the institution of marriage. Helen's struggles against her husband's control and her fight for autonomy reflect the broader societal constraints placed on women in Victorian England. And Brontë critiques the legal and social systems that trap women in abusive marriages, offering a powerful argument for women's rights and independence. Addiction and moral responsibility. The novel presents a clear moral stance on the dangers of addiction and the importance of personal responsibility. Arthur's alcoholism and debauchery are portrayed as not just personal failings but as symptoms of a corrupt society that enables and excuses such behavior in men. The novel's depiction of addiction is stark and realistic, avoiding romanticized notions of redemption or reform. Marriage and independence. Marriage is a central focus of the novel, and Brontë uses Helen's experience to critique the traditional ideal of marriage as a woman's ultimate goal. Helen's journey is one of self-determination, as she learns to prioritize her own well-being and her son's future over societal expectations. The novel ultimately advocates for partnerships based on mutual respect and moral integrity, rather than conventional notions of romance or social status. Conclusion: The Tenant of Wildfell Hall is a groundbreaking novel that challenges the social norms of its time, particularly in its depiction of women's rights, marriage, and moral responsibility. Through Helen Huntingdon's story, and Brontë offers a powerful critique of Victorian society, highlighting the dangers of unchecked male privilege and the need for women's independence and agency. The novel's bold themes, realistic characterizations, and unflinching portrayal of addiction and abuse make it a timeless work that continues to resonate with modern readers. Created for Squeeze That Book channel. Please subscribe to follow new videos. And leave a comment with your thoughts about the book.